Good evening, everyone. Well, I have to start by thanking all of the many people and institutions involved in this invitation to speak to you. I'm very, very happy to be able to talk about this topic here because, well, Cochin has been one of my field sites, and being back in Cochin is always a pleasure for me. So when I got the invitation, I thought I would do something a little generic, so I will not focus on a particular area, a particular variety, but I will give you an impression of what my own involvement has been in researching these languages that we call the Indo-Portuguese Creoles, but also what's the history of their documentation. So what are the sources that we have to know something about their history, what they used to be like and what they are like. So the topic is this, researching the Indo-Portuguese Creole languages, and Professor Elias has already mentioned what it is that we understand by Creole language, but let me just repeat it here. What are the Indo-Portuguese Creole languages? These are the characteristic, but not the only, languages of the Asian Portuguese communities of South Asia, or at least they used to be, because as you will see, many of these varieties, of which we know from historical sources, have now disappeared. These languages are classified in linguistics as Creole languages rather than what one might expect as varieties of Portuguese, even though there's a clear relationship between the two. They are classified as Creole languages, separate languages that are born out of contact between a number of different languages. In this particular case, Portuguese obviously is one of the components, and then depending on the location in South Asia that we're looking at, the local language and perhaps a few others are also part of the mix. In the case of Kerala, obviously Malayalam is an important source in this case. They're classified as Creole languages because they originate from intense language contact, and you can see that from the way they look, so the way they function, the transformations that you can see when you look at their makeup, linguistic makeup, because they show a degree of linguistic hybridism that prevents a straightforward phylogenetic classification. So it'd be really difficult to say that this language is related to Portuguese. It is related to Portuguese, but it's also related to Malayalam, to Marathi, to Tamil, to all of the other languages that were involved in their birth and in their development. Because they show certain structural features thought to be typical of Creole languages in general, and there are many other Creoles around the world. Some of the most famous, of course, are from the Caribbean and from the Atlantic world, but here in Asia, there's many languages of the same nature as well. And finally, because they arose in a socio-historical context which is similar to that of other Creole languages like the ones of the Caribbean, and in the particular case of the Indo-Portuguese Creoles that we're talking about colonial interactions, the colonial presence of the Portuguese in this part of the world. Now, I mentioned the Caribbean here because this is a well-known site of creolization that people are aware of, but even though colonialism is involved in all of these spaces, the actual nature of the linguistic interaction and of the social makeup in all of these places is not necessarily the same. So, for example, in the case of South Asia, we don't find plantation settings like the ones that gave rise to languages like Jamaican Creole and so many other Creoles that we know. So the diffusion of Portuguese in this part of the world, and by this part of the world I mean not just South Asia, but Asia in general, is something that, of course, as you know, is linked with Portugal's colonial expansion. And in the Asian context, this is something that starts, well, symbolically anyway, in 1498, this being the date of the arrival of Vasco da Gama's fleet on the shores of Calicut. So essentially the diffusion of the Portuguese language along coastal Asia, or some pockets of coastal Asia, is, well, essentially a product of the 16th century. And what's perhaps interesting for us being here in Kochi is that because the so-called Malabar Coast was the first place where the Portuguese arrived and established their settlements, it plays a pivotal role in this history. So that's why when you look at this map, you have the coast of Kerala highlighted as the place of the initial contact, let's say, and essentially it was from here that the Portuguese explorations, coastal explorations and navigations in different directions across Asia, all the way to Southeast Asia, proceeded in the early 16th century. Now, this diffusion of the Portuguese language, the arrival of the Portuguese language in a highly multilingual setting such as India and such as Asia in general, is essentially, just one more small addition to the complexity, but it's one that from a European perspective particularly, had an impact because when the following European colonials came to this part of the world, they often found that the Portuguese language was the one that allowed them to communicate with local populations across coastal Asia. And that means that Portuguese established itself for some sections of the population, for some particular activities like trade, established itself as a kind of lingua franca of Asian ports. There were many other linguistic consequences to this history, and of course, perhaps the most visible one is the kind of linguistic exchange or lexical word exchange that happened between Portuguese and so many languages in Asia, Malayalam being one of the ones that absorbed the most Portuguese words, and I'm sure you're aware of some of them. In fact, you're sitting on, on an object that has a name derived from Portuguese. So there are lots of different consequences, products of this contact, which started in 1498, and today I'm focusing on the Asian creoles, the Asian Portuguese creoles. That is to say, the languages that became, for some of the Eurasian communities or European influenced communities that developed in many parts of Asia, became their first language. Not the only one, but their first language for many centuries. This map will show you many places along Asia, the Asian coasts, where Asian Portuguese creoles used to be spoken. You can see this is not a full list, obviously, but at least it gives you an idea of what the spread looks like. And it also shows you something else, is that if you focus on South Asia, you have a big concentration there. So it was an important phenomenon, linguistic phenomenon in this part of the world. And you can see that in addition to South Asia, which I will show you in more detail in a moment, you had Asian Portuguese Creole spoken in Malacca, Singapore, Batavia, and nearby Tugu, Batavia being nowadays Jakarta. Bidau in East Timor, and East Timor, as you perhaps know, is still one of the officially Asian Portuguese-speaking countries in Asia. Macau, which was another Portuguese colony, as you probably know, with offshoots to Hong Kong and to Shanghai, and a few other places, right? So this gives you an idea of the maximum spread of the existence of these languages, which varied from place to place. But if I now show you the map of where these languages are spoken nowadays, you will see how much it's contracted. So these are the varieties that are now spoken. In India, you have the varieties of Diu, Daman, Korlai, and in Kannanur, there are still a few speakers. I will tell you about that in a moment. And then you have Malacca, in fact, Singapore as well. In Singapore, something quite interesting is that the Eurasian community in Singapore, which had almost completely lost the use of this language, is now reviving it for identitary reasons. So it's an interesting dynamic that's going on there. And in Macau. Now let's focus on South Asia. This map gives you more detail, right? So according to what I've been able to find, and this is from my doctoral dissertation, which I will mention in a moment, and you'll see why. These are places where we have some sort of indication, perhaps archival indication, or more than that, that either Portuguese or a variety of Portuguese or something that was mistaken for Portuguese, being the creoles that we're talking about, used to be spoken at some point in history. And again, if I contrast this with the modern day situation, you will see how it has changed. Now, this map was produced by myself in 2009, and you will see Cochin right there, right, with a strike through it. And that is because at the time, there was at least one speaker still left in the Cochin area, which I was able to interview, and I will tell you about him in a moment, but he passed away. So to the best of my knowledge, and I could be wrong, and in fact I hope I'm wrong, there are no more active speakers of this language in the Cochin region since 2010. And I've added Jaffna here in Sri Lanka because as part of one of the projects I'll tell you about, which was about Sri Lanka, me and my team were able to identify speakers in Jaffna against our expectations, right? So we were focusing on the East Coast where we knew that the language was still spoken, but apparently there are still a few speakers in Jaffna as well, so I added that to this map. So you know something about the distribution of these languages. Now I'd like to tell you what kind of information do we have. So what are the linguistic records, what are the documents that we can find for this, to know these languages, to know the history of these languages, especially the ones that have ceased to be spoken. So where's the information? And essentially there are three different phases of documentation of these languages, which are very different in nature. And the first phase is one that takes us back to the 19th century. So throughout the 19th century, there was a stream of linguistic documentation or documents documenting or describing one of these languages, but only one, and that was the Creole of Ceylon, that is to say, of Sri Lanka. And that is perhaps because throughout the 19th century in Ceylon, in modern-day Sri Lanka, the language was still very much an important language of the community. Therefore, a lot of people, including or especially people associated with British missions, but not only British missions, decided that they had to focus on this language, describe it, do something about it, record it, use it as well. So the 19th century is the first phase, but it pertains only to the Creole of Ceylon, so not the other ones. And in this period, what we have is very interesting things like, for example, in 1811, we have the second edition, and we don't know when the first one was published, but we have the second edition of what is essentially a grammar of this language. This is quite rare when it comes to Creole languages, as you're probably aware, that they are so early on taken as the object of a full grammar. Right? This happened in Ceylon, and it was produced by someone called Berenger, and we don't know much about who Berenger was. It says, learning the corrupted Portuguese as spoken in India, but it was published in Colombo, and the variety that's described is the one of Ceylon. You also have a dictionary in Ceylon, Portuguese, Sinhalese, and English languages, published by the Wesleyan Mission Press, so to aid missionary activities. And in 1819 and in 1820, you have a different one, a vocabulary of the Ceylon Portuguese and English languages with a series of familiar phrases. So you have a number of things describing the language, but you also have, because there is this intervention of people associated with the Wesleyan mission in particular, you also have translations and the production of religious literature in that language for the consumption of Christian communities in Ceylon, including a short-lived but interesting newspaper or magazine called Bon Novas, and another one called O Brufador, hymnals, prayer books, and many other sources like this, which again makes a very significant and important corpus of linguistic information that is not available for other varieties. And in addition to that, we're lucky to have what we call the Neville manuscript. And the Neville manuscript is a manuscript that was, well, produced or at least collected by a British official called Hugh Neville in the 19th century, which is essentially a collection of oral traditions in Creole Portuguese from Ceylon. And this manuscript is now kept in the British Library, and it has been studied and researched. I'll show you just a few of these sources from the 19th century. What you have here is the first grammar, the one from 1811. This is the cover page. This is a page from Fox's 1819 dictionary, which is in Sinhalese, in Ceylon Portuguese, and in English. And here you have the Book of Common Prayer of the Church of England translated into Ceylon Portuguese Creole. And you have a translation of the Gospel according to St. Matthew, also in Portuguese Creole from Ceylon. Why this focus on Ceylon Creole? Because, as we learn from this quote by someone who's quite important, and I'll tell you why, this was the impression that he had about the importance of this language. He says, "It is no wonder that the Creole of Ceylon enjoys a preeminent position among the colonial Portuguese dialects and is the most well-known abroad. It is spoken as a mother tongue by almost all Eurasians or burghers, as they're known in Sri Lanka to this day, and learned out of commercial, domestic, or religious convenience by many Europeans and natives. It has a considerable literature and keeps producing books, booklets, and periodicals, which can be clearly seen to have numerous readers. It is a cultivated and defined dialect of exuberant vitality." This was written by a Goan priest called Sebastião Delgado in 1900. He's an important person because he's going to be one of the main figures of the second phase of documentation of these languages. He was a priest, he was philologically trained, he ended up being a professor of Sanskrit at the University of Lisbon, where he died in 1922. But he had also spent some time as Vicar General in Colombo, so he knew the location, he knew the place, he knew the community and the language. This brings us to the second phase. The second phase happens in the turn of the century, so towards the late 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, because this is a period in which, in many sciences, but also in linguistics, new approaches, new, more scientific, empirical approaches come to be applied. And that is true also of linguistics, and specifically of Creole linguistics. In this second phase, at the turn of the century, Creole studies begins a scientific discipline, and the person who is often credited with turning this kind of endeavor into a scientific endeavor is a German linguist or philologist called Hugo Schuchart. And he's one of the figures because he was very interested in the varieties of Portuguese and the Portuguese creoles all over the world, including the ones in Asia. So Hugo Schuchart is going to be one of the first to write articles about several of the creoles in India, including the one of Cochin in 1882, Diu 1883, Mangalore in 1883, one about Indo-Portuguese in general in 1889, Mahé and Cananor in 1889, and he did not publish but prepared a manuscript about Ceylon Creole, which has now been studied by another scholar, a recent scholar, called Shehan de Silva Jayasuriya. Hugo Schuchart's work, and I'll ask you to remember this name because it's coming back in a moment. Hugo Schuchart's work influenced the gentleman who gave us the previous quote, Father Delgado from Goa. And so he was so impressed, he decided to complement Hugo Schuchart's work. They were in touch, they exchanged letters. And Sebastião Rodolfo Delgado decided to work on the varieties that Schuchart had not worked on. So he published an article about the Creole of Ceylon in 1900, from which I took that quote. One about the Creole of Daman in 1902-3, one about the Creole of Bombay in 1906, one about Nagapatnam in 1917, and one about a song that he collected in Goa in 1919. So these are the main figures of this endeavor when it comes to the Indo-Portuguese Creoles. In addition to that, we have a few other sources from the same period, including a collection of oral traditions from Ceylon, collected by Tavares de Melo in the beginning of the 20th century, so this is published and we know it, and then a few other studies about specific aspects or broad studies about Indo-Portuguese in general by Emilio Petetza, Francisco Adolfo Coelho, William Gunatileca, Jerónimo Quadros, etc., etc. So you can, when you start piecing these things together, you actually find a fair bit of data, including for varieties which were spoken at the time but are not spoken now. Let me get back to Hugo Schuchart, because you can see that he was very prolific. He wrote a lot, and this is only a section of what he did. But he was working in Austria, and he basically did not live in Austria. So he did not leave Austria. He did not do field work. What he did at the time, of course, like many other people, was send letters to people who were in specific locations and ask them to collect data and send it back to them, which means that his own epistolary collection, which is preserved in the University of Graz in Austria, where he used to work, is a treasure trove of information that he hasn't published. And I've been going through that, through that collection and find that he has received in his letters information from all of these places that you see here, even though he only published about the ones in blue. Right? So there's bits and pieces of information that you can still collect from his letters or the letters he received. Sometimes it's nothing too important, but sometimes it's really important, especially when it refers to varieties that have disappeared. Here's one example, just to show you how rich the archival materials can still be and how much there might potentially still be to find in archives. This is a letter that he received from a Portuguese priest called António Tomás Leitão y Castro. And he got it in 1884. At the time, Leitão y Castro was bishop prelate in Mozambique, another Portuguese colony in Eastern Africa, but he had been a former resident in Malapur. So he had been in Malapur in nowadays Tamil Nadu. And he writes the following in his letter. This is a relatively long, but I just want you to get an impression of the kind of information that's still out there. He says, having traveled the Coromandel coast and having resided for a while in Malapur, I haven't found nothing written in Creole Portuguese, and I do not think there is anything. In Malapur and Madras, there are now few people who speak it, but on the contrary, in Kadalur, Pondicherry, Tranquebar, and Carical, that is the language used by the Christian East Indian people, or hatted men, or men in hats. However, it differs so much from our Portuguese that it is impossible to have the slightest idea of what those Indians want to say to us, nor are we able to make them understand our Portuguese. This is not surprising because, in fact, these creoles that we're talking about can be very, very different from Portuguese. The Portuguese language mixed there with Tamil, French, and English, which is nowadays the official language of the entire coast, with the exception of the small territories of Pondicherry and Carical, has become corrupted, it seems to me, with the Portuguese words losing their endings, with the spirit of pronunciation, following the ways of foreign languages such as English and Tamil in the declension of nouns, the conjugation of verbs, and the transposed placement of words, that is to say, a different word order than Portuguese would have. Designating some objects by their Tamil name, others by the name they have in Portuguese or English, and admitting from those languages one part of the clause or another. So the impersonal infinitive of verbs or any other tense or person came to designate all tenses and persons, that is to say, the complexity of Portuguese verbal paradigms has been reduced, which is of course typical of Creole languages. For example, mim papiar is what they say for I speak. Vos patem bom for father, are you well? Means atavai for I am leaving right away. Berig, belly, fome, hunger, comer, eat. For I am hungry, I want to eat. Creole Portuguese therefore differs from ours in the intonation of the voice imitated from other languages, in the rapid pronunciation of words there fusing the end of one with the beginning of another in such a way that they cannot understand anything, in the adulteration of Portuguese words through the omission of syllables as much as the end at the beginning. Example, the word estar, which in Portuguese means to be, which is reduced to ta by suppressing the first syllable and the r of the last one. In the meaning of many of those words, such as ter meaning star, so to have meaning to be, in the introduction of foreign words just as adulterated as ours, and some more and some more. I don't want to bore you with it. I just want to show you that this brief letter seems like it doesn't give you a lot of linguistic information, but actually it's all the information that we have to reconstruct what would have been the Portuguese Creole of the Coromandel coast, with the exception of Nagapatnam, right? So this is precious, and it allows us, in fact, even though there's not a lot of information, but it allows us to locate those varieties within the wider context of the Indo-Portuguese Creole. So there's a lot of work still to do, and a lot, perhaps, potentially to research. Now, after the beginning of the 20th century, maybe around the 1920s, there is a gap. There's no production, no real production about these languages until the 1970s, and this is where I think the third phase of documentation begins, with modern documentation and description of the creoles and of the oral traditions associated with these languages. Important works around this time are the work of a Romanian linguist, Laurențiu Teban, about the creole of Corlai. Corlai is one of the varieties that still exists south of Bombay. When it comes to Sri Lanka, especially the descriptive work of Ian Smith about the Creole of Sri Lanka, especially the variety of Batiklo, which he did throughout the 1970s before the beginning of the civil war, which affected that part of Sri Lanka. And when it comes to India, the descriptive work of Clancy Clements, a professor at Indiana University, about the Creoles of Korlai and about the Creoles of Daman. So he did work on those two varieties especially. And then there's work about oral traditions, mostly the Sri Lankan ones, done by K. David Jackson and by Shihan de Silva Jayasuriya. And K. David Jackson, in fact, worked not only on Sri Lanka, especially on Sri Lanka, but also on the Malabar. And he was here, he collected some information from some of the last speakers in the Cochin region. I'll show you something about this in a moment. These are perhaps the most important descriptive works to come out in this third phase. On your left, you have Ian Smith's description of Sri Lanka Portuguese, and on the right, you have Clancy Clements' description of Korlai Creole. Now, up until the turn of the 21st century, this was what was going on, and then some more work begins to be done, and this is the section of this third phase that I'm involved in, because I myself started working on some of these varieties. About the Creole of Diu from 2005 essentially onwards, on the Creoles of the Malabar starting in 2005, and on Sri Lanka starting in 2017. In addition to my own work, there's also work done by other people, some of whom were my students, so it's like let's say, a derivation or a consequence of the work that I did, including Ana Krajinovic, who wrote her MA dissertation about the Malabar Creole, and Patricia Costa, Mahesh Radhakrishnan, and Rui Pereira, who were team members of my team in Sri Lanka, who've also produced and keep producing work about this variety. And then there are other articles by other people, such as Sebastian Nordhoff, Bandara, Fernando Sloma, and Sons, mostly about Sri Lanka. So there's a resurgence, let's say, of work, of documentation work, and as you can see, I've been involved in some of it. So what I'd like to do now is just to tell you a little bit, very briefly, about each of the projects that I've conducted in this part of the world, starting with Diu, the Creole of Diu. This was my doctoral dissertation, so this was my first introduction to the theme, and I started it in 2004, finished in 2009. The Creole of Diu was at the time, and perhaps is still, spoken by less than 200 people, so we're talking about a very small community within an island which is not that big anyways. But it included children, which means that there was still, and there still is, transmission to the younger generations, and in fact, the children, some of whom you see here on break during their school day, were some of my most precious informants because they spoke the language as their first language at home, even though, of course, they spoke Gujarati and English as well. So I started in 2005. This was my first trip. I started, doing documentation with the material that you see on the photo, some of which looks a little bit archaic now, especially the mini disc here, which you wouldn't use anymore. But at the time, this was the height of fashion. And so with this material, I started collecting data, which I needed for my dissertation, which was a grammar of this language, which had not been described before, except for the 1883 article by Hugo C. So there was a big, more than a century gap between the two. This is what it sounds like, and I understand that perhaps, if you're not familiar with Portuguese, it will not be clear to you how divergent this language is from Portuguese, but I will show it to you anyway, so that you have a feel of what it sounds like. And this is just part of a story that was told to me by a young person at the time, Stephen Almeida. He was a child, he's now a grown man. It sounds like this.
Macaque e crocodile. Macaque vai, no jungle para trazer cois. Arroz, tudo. Ele tinha loja, ele foi trazer arroz. E ali tem mar, ele viu crocodile, né? O crocodile disse assim, onde vai? Ele disse que eu vai agora não comprar arroz, depois da arroz eu vai na casamento da minha irmã.
Okay, then the story goes on. I will not spend much time here because, if you don't know Portuguese or these languages, it'll be difficult to explore it conveniently. And also because I want to get to the Malabar, which is, I think, a topic that you might be interested in. So I did this kind of documentation out of necessity because I needed the data for my dissertation. And this is the result. So this is the book that came out of my research. It's called the Indo-Portuguese Language of Diu, and it's a grammar of Diu Creole. Now, one other consequence of the work that I did was that I was able to include this language in a very important resource for Creole linguistics in general, which is called the Atlas of Pidgin and Creole Languages. This is a very large project that was developed with many people, but it was centered at the Max Planck Institute in Leipzig in Germany. And at the time, they were collecting information from specialists in as many Creole and Pidgin languages as they could to create a database of comparable data. And because I was doing this work at the time, I was able to add Diu to the mix, which means that when it comes to the Indo-Portuguese Creole specifically, this atlas, which you can access online, also all of this information is online, and it's actually quite a beautiful resource to explore. When it comes to Indo-Portuguese, there are three varieties represented. The one of Diu, of course, is my own contribution. The one of Corlai is Clancy Clement's contribution, and Ian Smith provided the data for Sri Lanka Creole. So we have three of the varieties there. Sadly, Malabar Creole is not, because my own research on this language was not developed enough at the time for it to happen. Now, interestingly, at this stage, I can also tell you about another follow-up project, because next month we will start a new project called Oral Corpus of the Indo-Portuguese Creoles of Daman in Diu, which is essentially a collaboration between myself and Clancy Clements, whom you know already. And the objective is to create an online corpus with data from these two varieties, combining my own field data from Diu, his own field data from Daman, and complementing that with new resources, new collections, data collections that we will develop in India and among the diaspora with people from Diu and Daman. Okay, so this is about to start. Project number 2 is about Kerala. And this started in 2006. In fact, it started in 2005. There's a mistake there. In 2005. The Creole spoken here has been known as the Malabar Creole generically, right? Referencing this name of the Malabar for part of this coast. And I've when I started doing this research, there was the idea, and it was even in print, that the Indo-Portuguese varieties of Kerala had gone extinct, so that nobody spoke it. But whoever wrote that was misinformed, because in fact there was a handful of speakers still. And I was fortunate enough to, from 2005, begin to locate these people and to do the same kind of documentation of their variety at the time. And I have to reference here someone who was instrumental, who was K.S. Matthew, whom I'm sure you will know, because he was the one who was able to direct me to the speakers of this language in Kannur at the time. And this is where I started, in Kannur. In 2005, I visited Kannur, where I spoke with 6 speakers. Sadly, one of them has passed away since, but there may actually be more speakers than I was able to interview at the time. In any case, the numbers that you find here are extremely low, which means that these varieties of Malabar Creole are really, really on their way out, right? They're really, at the brink of extinction. In Calicut, I was able to interview one speaker. She was in Calicut, she lived in Calicut, and to be honest, I'm not sure if she's still around, but she was from Talicherry. Which is also significant because one of the speakers in Kannur was also from Talicherry, and he was this lady's brother. So there was a family tradition going on there. In Cochin, I was able to interview and talk to Mr. William Rosario, whose photo you see there. And he was a very nice and very kind man who told me that he was the last speaker of the language in Vaipin, because the second last speaker, his neighbor Francis Painter, had passed away 3 years before I visited him for the first time. Now, of course, while I was in Cochin, I asked around, I tried to find out whether there might be people who knew the language in other parts of the region. There are for sure, but what you often have is fragmentary information. So bits of songs, some sayings, but Mr. Rosario was a fluent speaker for whom this language was his first language when he was growing up. He passed away in 2010, so if my information is correct, then since 2010 there haven't been fluent speakers of the language in the Cochin area. So I started in Kannur, as I told you, and the place where the few speakers live in Kannur, to anyone who might know Kannur, is this area here, not far from the fort called Barnasheri. So this is where they lived, and they still live. And here's a little bit of speech in Kannur Creole. Now, again, it's a pity that this is not very easy to interpret, because what you will hear here is a linguistic variety which is very different from the one from Diu. It might not sound it, but it is grammatically very, very different. And in fact, for a speaker of Portuguese, almost completely incomprehensible the first time you hear it.
Pokan madanse, gato com rato bomba camratini. Olo tu casa dentro tin fica. Akla rato ja gato spaccia fala. Agar chuve sauce nosku forno pavai. Akasuida agar vai kanda nosku izar kere sigra garda. Olo tu butiga jafai la grandi unjar dentro manteiga chapidi. Manteiga pidi kanda o igrejas parto building tene quebrado casa. Ala jafai kan jo kubri garda.
Okay, so most of the terms that you find there are from Portuguese. They've been transformed, they've been altered, they've been reinterpreted, but the way the language functions is very much like Malayalam. And this is part of the research that I've been doing, finding out what's the extent of the contribution of Malayalam to the development of this language. And in fact, in many, many ways, this language in grammatical terms is much more Dravidic than it is Portuguese. Now, in Cochin, I already mentioned Mr. William Rosario, who was the person that I was able to work with, lived in Vaipin, very close to this church, which some of you may know, the Church of Our Lady of Hope, a very old Portuguese church at the tip of Vaipin. Apparently, so he was the last speaker that I was able to find, even though, of course, again, some people knew bits and pieces of the language, they knew fragments, sentences, etc. Several years earlier, Professor K. David Jackson, who was working on the oral traditions, not just of Sri Lanka, but also this part of India, visited Vaipin as well, and he interviewed Mr. Francis Painter, who was the second last speaker, the one who had passed away just before I visited for the first time. So this is something that he publishes out of the interview that he had with Mr. Painter, which is quite revealing of his memories, referring back to the 40s and the 50s, about how the language was used in Vaipin back then. And he says, here in the parish of Our Lady of Hope, the Porto Indians have two confraternities. One is the confraternity of the Child Jesus, and the other one is the confraternity of Our Lady of Rosary. Every year they would have two feasts which lasted from Monday to Sunday, and one of the members would be elected presidente, and then he uses the Portuguese term, presidente. In this reunion, it was a sign of culture to speak only Portuguese, because English was considered the language of the owners of boutiques, the shops or grocers. The funniest was that you always considered English speakers inferior, when in reality those people were financially better off and lived in much better conditions. But the tradition was such that you only consider real Indo-Europeans those who spoke Portuguese. So there was this identification of the Luso-Asian community with being able to use Portuguese. And according to his recollection, it seems to have been quite widespread up until the 40s and the 50s, but evidently it was already in a process of decline, and that's why now we no longer find fluent speakers. And Mr. William Rosario himself concurred. In fact, he did not grow up in Vaipin, he grew up in Wainad. He was born in the plantations in Wainad, but his family had the tradition of speaking Portuguese. And when I asked him about his childhood and his memories of using the language, he says the following. When you were born, your family spoke Portuguese?
Yes, my family. Only Portuguese, no other language.
Then there in the estate, you said?
In the estate. Then...
Ali nasceu? Ali já nasceu?
Ali já nasceu.
Wainad.
Wainad. Estate dentro.
Onde?
Estate.
Longe?
Bomba longe aqui, sim.
Boas famílias portuguesas?
Minha papai e mamãe tudo português. Mamãe tudo bastante porca saeta lota.
Okay, you will notice that midway in our conversation he switches to the Creole, which is actually what I was looking for. And so we did a translation, and this is it. He says he was born there in Wainad, in the estate. It's very far from here. And then I asked, was your family Portuguese? He says, my grandfather, my grandmother, they were all Portuguese. My grandmother and the others used to wear a blouse and a skirt. So again, attire being another indication or community identifier for him. Now, what I find interesting is that we have the word papani here, which I think is very appropriate at this time of New Year, because you have the budding of the papani, right? And this is a word that is used in this language for grandfather. Okay, a follow-up project which I started during my visits to Cochin was an exploration of the Portuguese language documents that are preserved in nearby Ernakulam regional archives. And this is because I knew that they existed, and I was interested in finding out what kind of linguistic information they provided. There are 56 documents in Portuguese in the archive. I've collected them all. 44 of these are letters, which are interesting documents because in many cases they are personal. Other letters are not very personal at all, they're very official, but some are personal letters. That's quite interesting. Dating 1693 through 1816. So quite a wide range, crossing the Dutch period, the Dutch colonial period, into the British colonial period, right? Which in itself is interesting because it shows how Portuguese kept being used after the Portuguese were expelled from this part of India for a long time. And the provenance of these letters in this, or the documents in this collection are all of these places that you see. Most of them come from this region, of course, but then you also have some that came from Goa, not surprising, from Bengal, and from Jakarta, which was at the time the headquarters of the Dutch colonial enterprise in the East. And these are very official documents sent by the VOC, the the Dutch East Indies Company, to the King of Cochin. So these are written in Portuguese, and these are very, very important documents. I've not brought any examples because this would be a completely separate talk, which would take forever, so I will leave it at that. But it might be interesting for you to know that there's this collection of documents not far from you, which give very, very interesting information about the use of Portuguese here. And in addition to this, you also have a much larger collection of Portuguese language documents in the Bishop's House in Fort Cochin, right? So there's a diocesan archive there which is full of documents written in Portuguese. And now I quickly jump to my third project, which is Sri Lanka. And these are organized chronologically because the one in Sri Lanka started more recently in 2015. This project ran essentially between 2015 and 2020. It was funded by the Endangered Languages Documentation Program, which was run by the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. And what I wanted to do, this was a much more ambitious project than I had done before. We had data about this variety from the 1970s, of course, and then that was interrupted due to the Civil War. Once the Civil War was finished, it was finally possible to think of restarting this kind of documentation in eastern Sri Lanka, which is where the language has been used the longest and is still used. So I decided to do that. And the objectives were, and they were fulfilled, to create a digital and open access corpus of modern Sri Lanka Portuguese, Creole, which ended up having nearly 50 hours of recordings and over 150 speakers represented. And it is available online. I will show you at the end the link in case you want to explore it. But I also wanted to work on the music and dance traditions of these communities because in Sri Lanka, those are the most visible and evident signs and most recognizable signs of the Portuguese burgher culture. I also wanted to conduct a sociolinguistic survey of the community to find out what's the status and vitality of the language, and also to collect archival sources which were deposited in our online collection. So this involved doing lots of recording sessions with lots of people in different settings. Maybe, in some cases you had groups of people talking, having a dialogue. This gentleman, for example, who is a carpenter, was showing me through his carpentry workshop and pointing the names or telling me the names in the language, in the Sri Lanka Portuguese language, the names of the materials and the tools. Here's a conversation between myself and a musician. And this lady was cooking, so it's like a cooking demonstration. And as she cooked, she described what she was doing. So there's a lot of data there. There's linguistic data, but there's much more than linguistic data. And as you can see, in this case, we worked mostly with video, which was fantastic. Here's a little sample. This is a conversation with two ladies who are telling me about the wedding traditions of the burgher community. And this was recorded in Trincomalee, which is one of the major cities in eastern Sri Lanka.
No anda primeiro canto andate noivo se pai chomatando anda akalai noiva se pai noiva pe chomatando anda
noivo Carlo
manda
noiva se casa
assim lá anda tona studio panda vintra este video nada no tamana studio anda foto tutira casa lovi ravana vai kinimpa etespa chomatando
baila.
So even if you can't understand the language, and I'm sure you can't, you can tell at least how fluent these ladies are. So it's really their first language. It's a language of everyday communication for part of the population, especially the older population, because this language is also beginning to decline when it comes to the younger population. So after we collected data like this, what we did was, my team and I, we produced this kind of linguistic analysis. This is very small, but what you have essentially is a transcription of the text, you have a translation of the text, and then you have a grammatical analysis of each element of the text. So this is prepared for linguistic research. In addition to that, I told you that we were interested in ethnomusicology and collecting information about music and dance. And there was, in fact, a team member who was a specialist, Mahesh Radhakrishnan, and he's the one who took one of these recordings with the same lady that you've heard before, and did a musical analysis, which I'm going to show you just a little bit of, so that you know the kind of work that we did.
Baila nonna bonita baila. Baila nonna bonita baila. Peya bosa saya nonna sakudi baila. Peya bosa saya nonna sakudi baila. Baila nonna bonita baila.
Okay, so the Portuguese burghers in Sri Lanka have a very, very rich musical tradition, which they still preserve and continue to perform. And in fact, if you're interested, very recently, last week, I think, a very young team member, a very young community member who is himself a speaker of this language, went on The Voice Sri Lanka singing a song in this language. And he went through. And what was interesting, as far as I can tell, was how the juries were completely surprised about this language and even the existence of this language in Sri Lanka, even though it is a language of the country. But it's really not very well known beyond the community itself. Finally, we did a sociolinguistic survey, which was a big, one of my team members, one of my students, Rui Pereira, he did a very large survey with questionnaires that were given to over 1,000 people to find out, what's their level of fluency in the language, where they use it, in what context they use it or not. And what you find is that, this is a description of, or an indication of the fluency in the language according to age groups from youngest to oldest. And what you can see is that, the language is really on the decline. Among the youngest population, there's less and less people who use this language because Tamil which is the dominant language in that area, is becoming more and more important and prevalent for them. In fact, 57% of those who responded, who are part of the community, had no fluency at all in the language. So, it's still there. It's still much more vital than what you find in Malabar, in Kerala, but it's also endangered. So just to conclude, if you're interested in looking at our materials from the Sri Lanka Portuguese Documentation Project, they are here in the Endangered Languages Archive. This is the link and the direct link to our collection. So there's lots of stuff there. Our recordings are there, the transcriptions are there, everything is there, and most of it is open access. It's not open access only if there's a reason not to make it open access, otherwise it is. And if you want to know about the work that we continue to do, my team and I in Lisbon continue to do about this language, we have the Facebook page, Sri Lanka Portuguese, where you can find out more about what's going on with this language and this community. And with this, and having spoken, I think, too much, I end. Thank you very much for your attention.
Portuguese Creole or the Dutch Creole?
Portuguese Creole. All of these are Portuguese Creoles. What happened in Sri Lanka, and also here, because in fact, both in the Malabar and in Sri Lanka, you have similar colonial cycles, right? So you have a Portuguese period of about 1.5 centuries, then you have a Dutch period for about 1.5 centuries, and then the British period, and then finally independence. So the situation is not that different between the two regions, and in both of them, you find some Dutch influence, especially in Sri Lanka. You have some Dutch influence, but very little. So there are some words from Dutch that have been integrated in this language, but it is not a Dutch-based Creole. It's really a Portuguese-based Creole, which over there is very clearly influenced in many ways by Tamil, just as much as here, it is very clearly influenced by Malayalam, right? And in fact, the two varieties, the ones of Kerala and the ones of Sri Lanka, have very striking similarities. So I've been looking at them as an ensemble, like a cluster between this bigger group of Indo-Portuguese Creoles. Those two share a lot of similarities.
Interesting, because one always thought that burghers in Sri Lanka were the descendants of the Dutch. Maybe.
Okay. Yes and no. So, but that's partly true. Burger is a Dutch term, right? So the name burger comes from Dutch burger, which means citizen, and it is applied in Sri Lanka to anyone of Eurasian ancestry or European ancestry. So all of them are classified as burghers, even though some of them have a Dutch ancestry, some have a Portuguese ancestry, and some might have different, provenances like British ancestry, etc. So they're all collectively known as burghers. But because there is a clear sociological and cultural difference between those two groups, those two majority groups within the burghers, it's now common to distinguish between the Dutch burghers and the Portuguese burghers, right? And the Portuguese burghers are the ones which have preserved this language longest, and the ones I've been researching. It's not that different, in fact, here, because the terms are different, but the situation is not. Because the people I've been working with here in Kannur or in Baipin, they are they identify as Luso-Asians, Portuguese-Asians, right? And their family names are an indication of that. But technically, they've been for a long time classified under the Anglo-Indian, label. So just like among the Burghers in Sri Lanka, you have these distinctions that have to be made within the community. Among the Anglo-Indians here, you also have to make these distinctions, right? And that's quite clear that, there are differences between the two groups. Don't be shy, because it's difficult for me to know, what are your interests and what it is that you already know or don't know.
This is not a question, but I just want to add, I'm from Kollam, and in Kollam Bishop House, they have Portuguese materials, but it's not open to public. I tried to see the archives, but they didn't give me the permission, but they do have a lot of Portuguese documents and Portuguese letters and a lot of archival material there.
In the bishop's house?
Yes.
Yes.
Which is not yet explored.
So a little bit like here as well.
Yeah.
The difference, I think, is here, I didn't know about this, but it's not surprising, because, there was a connection with the Archbishop in Goa for a long time for many of these dioceses, right? So the Portuguese language continued to be used among the clergy until quite recently, well, the 20th century. Here in Cochin, the archive there's been an intervention, and it was funded by a Portuguese foundation, the Gulbenkian Foundation. So, they have a separate room prepared to house and preserve the documents, and they are publicly available. Perhaps in Kollam the situation is different. But speaking of Kollam, this was one of the places where this language used to be spoken, right? And when I was doing my survey here in Kerala, I went to Kollam, and especially to the region, you will know the name.
Tangasheri.
Tangasheri, exactly. And I spoke to lots of people there at the time. They gave me a lot of information about memories of the language being used, but not, active production of the language. But of course, actually, if anyone here is aware of other people who speak this language, I'll be very, very happy to hear from you.
My question is about Burger's version of Portuguese Creole. Does it have a separate grammatical base and script, or does it operate within the Tamil or Sinhalese universe of linguistic universe?
The situation is not so different between all of these varieties, because when I started doing research on them, there was really no tradition of writing. So the languages were used essentially orally. And that meant that for each of these projects, I had to come up with a way to represent it orthographically. In the case of Kerala, which you've seen, right? When I showed you those clips, there was a transcription, and the transcription was according to my own system, let's say. In the case of Diu and Malabar, I did it myself. In the case of Sri Lanka, I decided to do it a little differently and better, I think. And there was a workshop in which a number of community members and speakers participated to test a few options, to see what works and what makes sense. And that's when we ended up with this system that we use for our documentation, which is, of course, our system. It's not an official system, right? There's no official orthography. These languages, in some cases, like Korlai, for example, south of Bombay, these languages sometimes are written using the script of the local language. So there are some texts in Korlai which have been produced using Marathi. And that makes perfect sense, because, it's a script that's available in the community, and that tendentially represents the sounds of these languages very well because of the influence of the local languages on them, right? So that works. And perhaps there might be some records of Malabar Creole in Malayalam that would make perfect sense. In the case of Sri Lanka, I don't know Tamil, my team doesn't know Tamil, or part of my team doesn't know Tamil, so we had to come up with a romanization for us to be able to do the work. Yeah. But when it comes to grammar, it's quite clear how much this Creole has taken from Tamil. Because, of course, these peoples are in all of these places, these people are multilingual, right? So they speak these varieties. Sometimes they speak them as their first language, or they spoke them as their first language at home when they were growing up. But, of course, they're perfectly fluent in whatever language is the language of the wider community, be it Gujarati, Marathi, Malayalam, or Tamil. Absolutely. Um, uh, all of the above, I would say.
Okay. Yes,
Luso-Indians,
but
all
we
of the
don't
above.
have that here in Kerala. Do so. Yes.
Yeah. Yes. So here in Kerala, the Anglo-Indian label is still there. It makes sense. You know, these people identify as Anglo-Indians, but they know that within the Anglo-Indians they're actually Luso-Indians, right? So there is an idea, and I asked them specifically about it. So is there an understanding of a separate Portuguese-related or Portuguese-influenced identity? And the answer was always yes. And when I asked, so what distinguishes you from other components of the Anglo-Indian community, they would reference, of course, the language, their surnames,
Yes.
right? And then a few food items, and something that came up in these conversations a lot was the use of wine. So wine, producing wine and drinking wine as something that is taken as very Luso-Indian among the Anglo-Indians. Yeah. So yeah, it's all of the above. There's this complex identity, I think, that categorizes these minority communities.
My name is Ranjit. I am a journalist by profession, hailing from Kollam, but settled here in Fort Cochin. So I was fortunate to be associated with Hugo many years ago when he was in Kerala for his research. So just to add to what you were asking regarding whether these people in Kerala identify themselves as Anglo-Indians or Latin Catholics, I can answer that a little more with clarity because I've been researching in this area for more than 20 years. So if you take the case of Kochi, the people who used to speak this Creole language, Creole Portuguese language, they identify themselves as Anglo-Indians, of course. And in olden days, they used to say, of course, yeah, we are Parangis. Although Parangi is sort of a derogatory term, it has acquired a derogatory meaning over the years, I would say. But still, they would proudly say they are Anglo-Indians. But if you go further down south to places like Kollam, where I hail from, and even to a few spots in Trivandrum, like Anjutenga and St. Andrews and Peta in Trivandrum city, there it's a very touchy question because the Latin Catholics generally down south, they all have, or 95% of them, they have surnames like Lopez, Pereira, Fernandez. It's all common. So, and until the 1940s, there was a sort of a social segregation between those who had some sort of a Portuguese ancestry and the other Latin Catholics who had Portuguese surnames. So the only way in those days to identify them was by means of, as Hugo was mentioning, the cuisine. So when there was feasts like Christmas, Easter, and the local church feasts, those families with a specific Portuguese ancestry or Portuguese association, they prepared certain Creole Indo-Portuguese dishes unlike the others. And most of them were vinegar-based and pork-based. That was one factor. Factor number two was the attire. So in one of the segments which was shown on the screen, there is a mention of skirt and a blouse. It was not exactly a skirt or a blouse. I would add to it, it was more of a wraparound or a sarong and a longer jacket called the kebaya, which was called kavayam in Malayalam. It was of Malayan origin. It came from Malacca, but it became the unofficial dress code of the women of this so-called Portuguese origin. From, I would say, from Cananur up till maybe Trivandrum. And it is still there in a few parishes in and around Kochi. But in Kollam, especially in my family, it has died out. And as far as I know, no old lady wears it. If you ask some elderly people, they will say, okay, my mama or my mama used to wear it. And because of societal pressure, they had two options. Either you move to a frock, and that too only those who had a good English education dared to wear a frock, because the frock was associated with English education, English language, and so on. So the rest, the only option was to switch to the sari. So in South Kerala, it is very difficult now for a person to say, they will say, oh yeah, we belong to that category where, like our mammanis used to wear the kavayam and we were slightly different from the others, slightly different. But that word has got a loaded meaning. And if you still dig deeper, there are a few families which say, we were actually Tupaikar. Tupaikar is a derivative of the word topazes in historical records. So tapasis has two meanings. One, they say like they claim to be of Portuguese origin, or they were associated with the Portuguese, and the Dutch derogatorily called them the Black Portuguese, which is the case with Bangladesh. There you have the Kala Firangis. There is a community called the Kala Firangis in Bangladesh. So the Topasis, they were derogatorily called the Black Portuguese because of their skin color. But and they say on record, they claim to be more Portuguese than the Portuguese. And their allegiance still lies with the Portuguese king. That is how they are mentioned in the Dutch record. So in a way, in Ernakulam and Kochi, the sense of identity is very, very, very profound. But if you go down south, due to intermarriages and so many other socio-economic factors, the sense of distinction has come down. They will say, okay, we are different from the others, or they have so many like local euphemistic ways of putting it. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. I'm happy you brought up the kabaya issue because this traditional dress associated with these communities is actually not exclusive of this part of India. In Goa, the elite Catholic families also used to have, of course they don't wear it every day, but they have like a traditional ceremonial dress, which is very similar to the kabaya. They call it the panbaju. And there is this idea, which of course I cannot confirm or infirm because I'm not a historian and I haven't done work on it, but there is this idea which makes some sense that it does come from Malaysia or from Southeast Asia because there are similar forms of dress there. And that in itself tells a very interesting history about, the circulation between all of these places where the Portuguese were, right? And then when it comes to the classification, it's complicated because you have these terms. In many South Asian languages, you have specific ways of referencing these communities, which are either derived from, as you said, Firangi, so the Paranki, for example, and that's still used in Sri Lanka, in Tamil, I believe, or from Topasi, right? The Dobashi, the interpreters, the referencing, well, according to one theory, referencing their multilingualism, right? The multilingualism of this community. So these two, but then you have the other terms which are, from the colonial systems, Berger, Anglo-Indian, right? East Indian, right? In the case of Bombay, the region of Bombay, what they use is East Indian. So, right, you have a number of different ways of making these distinctions, which can be overlapping and perhaps porous, right? So it's not very clear sometimes how to classify. I was wondering if there's anyone in the audience from this community. There might be. No? Okay. Near Cranganore. Right. Right. So Cranganore being one of the important locations in this history, right? Yes. And actually, so as part of my research, I've surveyed, of course, many of these communities along the coast of Kerala, but also along the coast of Tamil Nadu, and the situation is very similar. Even though the language has really completely died out over there, in sociological terms, in historical terms, these communities have a continuation across both coasts of South India. It's called Kordlai. No. It's Kordlai. It's a very small village. It's near Revdanda. That's the bigger place there. And it's a small village, a small fishing and agricultural village. Across the river from the ruins of one of the important Portuguese cities, which was Shaul. It's here, right? So Shaul is ruined in the 17th century or 18th century, I think. It was taken over by the Marathas, and according to local legend, and perhaps it's true, the Christian population moved outside of the city and crossed the river. It's a big wide river. And established itself on the other side in this village called Kordlai. And the village has been relatively isolated until recently, and that's perhaps the reason why the language has survived this far. But nowadays it's not as isolated anymore, and Marathi is really becoming very dominant there. It's a very interesting place if you ever have a chance to visit. Quite unique. Yes, yes. There's a lot. In fact, a lot of the research that I myself have been doing about the Malabar Creoles has been a comparison with Malayalam. So I have a number of publications looking at how the Creole stands or how it compares, both with Malayalam and with Portuguese. And that tells us quite interesting stories, because the earliest data that we have is from the late 19th century, and it's not a lot, as you can tell, it's not a lot. So we don't actually know much about what the language was like throughout most of its history. But this comparison tells us something about it. And it seems to me that when it was formed, this Creole was a little less like Malayalam, and then over centuries of multilingualism and coexistence, it became very much like Malayalam. So there's a historical dynamic there, which results in a language which is very, very Dravidic in its essence, let's say, but which preserves forms which are almost entirely from Portuguese. If you're interested, I have stuff that I can share with you.
I'm curious about how these creoles came into being, whether it was through marriage of two cultures, of two people coming together, or was it the colonizers trying to get more popular among the people, and probably the caste of the people from who were the natives of the place, who kind of accepted such a Creole. Kind of a thing, yeah. I'm not sure.
That is a complicated question, I have to say, because we don't have as much information as we would like. Let's say demographic information and information about everyday life. So we need social history of the 16th century, of the early 16th century, to find out how this happened. So since we don't have that, all we can do is hypothesize. And I actually have a very conjectural paper which I wrote about the Creoles of the Malabar, about what could be involved in their origins. And without taking any stance, because it's difficult to, I think there's a number of things that are important here. First of all, these Portuguese settlements, the early Portuguese settlements, were necessarily highly multilingual, right? Because you had people who spoke Portuguese natively, but actually not so many. And then you had a lot of people who came from Europe who were not native speakers of Portuguese, so that's one other layer of linguistic complexity. You had local population speaking Malayalam, obviously, but then you had groups from other parts of Asia which might have spoken other languages as well. You had the presence of Africans who were brought here as enslaved people, and they brought their own languages with them. And then you have, so you see, all of this creates a linguistic mix which is conducive to this kind of linguistic restructuring that we see. One issue which I think is very, so, a lot of people talk about intermarriage as being one of the means, one of the reasons why this kind of interaction happens, and that makes a lot of sense. But I think it's not the only story, and the conversion, the process of conversion by the I was going to say Portuguese missionaries, but in fact, most of them were not Portuguese. So those were, some of the people who used Portuguese but were not native speakers, right? But, missionaries working under the Portuguese padroado, right? So the conversions that came after that are very likely to have resulted in a kind of cultural realignment towards the Portuguese, which would have had a linguistic consequence as well, right? So it's really complicated. I don't think there has to be a single factor responsible for this, because actually the situation was anything but simple, linguistically speaking. In fact, in the ports of Malabar, the situation was already highly complex, linguistically speaking, before the Portuguese arrived, right? So this is not new in the history of India.
Another question. So when you're studying a Creole, it's not just the comparison of two languages then, right? Because there's so many cultures, as you said. So how many languages do you layer upon each other to study a Creole per se?
Well, you can approach these languages in many different ways. One way is to say, okay, I'm just interested in describing this language and finding out how it works, in its own terms, right? In the modern day, This is how it works. These are the components. This is the grammar, etc., etc. This is one perspective, which I have taken in some of my work. But I'm also interested in this historical bit and in finding out, what influences have come to this result. So then, of course, you have to start comparing with the language or the languages that would have been relevant in each space. Evidently here, Malayalam, right? So I've done this comparison as well. And then a third approach, which I've also taken, which I think is interesting, is comparing these creoles to each other. Because one of the things I'm interested in is finding out, is there any continuity between these varieties, right? You remember this map here where I, where I showed that, the Malabar is the place where the initial contact happens, and then there's this continuation of the expansion of the language. Can there be anything in these other varieties which can be traced back to that initial contact in the Malabar? This is a hypothesis that's out there. It's called the primacy of the Malabar hypothesis. And there have been some proposals that, maybe some linguistic structures may have resulted first here and then been taken over to places like Malaysia, Macau, etc., through these sea routes. So I'm also interested in this part of the history. But, I think you'll understand that, if you're doing that based solely on modern linguistic data, your results are never going to be super solid, right? Because you lack information about what these languages were like when they were formed, right? So yeah, there are some difficulties in this kind of work.
Thank you.
I had a question. So in the case of local languages, the language changes not only with geography, but also caste and class. So in this presentation, I'm not too familiar with Creole, but you seemed to show like Creole in a specific region as a monolith. Is that the case, or does it vary across strata of society?
You're very right. It's not a monolith. Not at all. The issue here is that when you're working with these communities nowadays, some of them are very small. And if they're very small, you cannot expect to find a lot of stratification. It's the case of the Malabar Creoles, right? So you have a handful of speakers, and what they speak is not exactly the same, but you have such few data points that there is a lot that you cannot say. I'll give an example. This is from a piece that I'm writing right now. There is a particular construction which is used in my collection in Malabar, is used only by Mr. Rosario, right? So the speakers in Kannada don't use it. And once you find that, you can ask yourself, okay, is this a regional variation? Is this a family variation? Is this a personal variation? Since he's the only speaker of this region, and he's not even from here, he's from Wainand, you cannot tell, right? So with small communities, it's very difficult to do this kind of, understanding. With bigger communities, you can see things happen. You can see stratification, social stratification. There's been a little bit of research about that, for example, about Cordlai. Clancy Clements have noticed that there is an age difference in how the language is used. And that affects the order of words within the sentence. He has also done a very interesting work about Daman. Here. Because the community in Daman is a little bigger, and he finds that there is a very clear socioeconomical distinction. So there are essentially two varieties. One is more upper class, not upper class, but let's say white collar, and the other one is more blue collar, right? So yes, of course, it's always there. And in fact, when it comes to Sri Lanka, where we have a lot more speakers and a lot more data since we've done our research, and also with the previous data that had been collected in the 1970s, one of the team members, Patricia Costa, is now doing her PhD. I'm supervising her, and her PhD is precisely about variation. So she has identified a few things, a few instances in which we have noticed that people don't use the language exactly the same way, and she's trying to, using statistics, she's trying to find out whether we're talking about a regional variant or a social variant, right? So you're absolutely right. It's not monolithic, and you're very right to point that out, and I'm happy you did.
Thank you.
Oh, yeah. 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 Not in the versions that I've collected. They're usually, Sri Lanka is a little different. I'll talk about Sri Lanka in a moment, but in the others, it's usually mostly from Portuguese, and whatever is not Portuguese is, well, maybe here and there a Malayalam word, which is of course understandable, but English is a source for, for some concepts. English is a source for these communities. In Sri Lanka, you find, in addition to this, English is not as prevalent there, so English is not necessarily that important. Tamil is, and you find bits of Dutch as well. So yeah, there are all these layers. Yeah, but nothing that strikes me in the varieties of Diu or Malabar that I've researched as being non-Portuguese. There's a conservatism, let's say, a lexical conservatism in these languages, which is quite evident, which also makes them quite interesting, because in many ways what you have here as the lexical component that you find here is 16th century Portuguese, so some elements that we no longer use in European Portuguese, and they are preserved here. Like butica, you saw butica over there, the term for a shop. It was very current in 16th century Portuguese, and nowadays we don't use it anymore, but this is what is used here.
Actually, this question is directly connected with Kochi and maybe our experience with that particular region. Because these are places that for a longer period of time, colonial, settlers have performed, their multiple rituals, whether it is religious or cultural or trade related, or then in Kochi has got a very chronological narrative to that. So I was just wondering, because when I looked up to the meaning of Creole in Portugal, it says that a language of a servant, raised, for your purpose, so it's like a kind of a, I found, the meaning of Creole very interesting in the context of, today's discourse also. So, because you see that, certain kind of colonial narrative, the last agency actually takes over and the supremacy, rules. In India is a big example in that sense. So, is it actually so? Just, globally, when you look at that kind of a, chronological, route of the colonies changing.
Yeah.
Also, in today's time, that you see a resurgence of linguistic research when it comes to proving one's own point, that to say I was there.
Yeah.
So there is a certain kind of a cultural or political interest in that sense. So just a curiosity, because of working for a longer period in a place like Kochi, that whether this, the language had that kind of an hierarchical, situation. That's why it also vanishes, because it was a servant for a time period.
Yes. Again, a difficult discussion for the following. When we use creoles in relation with these languages, we're not using a local term or a term that the communities use. We use it in a technical term, in the technical linguistic sense, to classify a particular kind of contact language. But the term creole, in its origin, comes from these colonial settings, and for some so-called Creole communities, the term is a local term. So it's a term that's used by the community that has a local meaning, referencing the community and the people, the mixed people themselves. This is the case of the Atlantic, for example. When in the Asian settings, when I use Creole, we use it in the linguistic literature as a technical term, because as far as I've been able to find out, among these Asian Portuguese communities, the term Creole existed, but it meant something different. It meant a child, usually a child, so someone, usually a child, who was brought into a family as, to be raised by that family. So she didn't belong to that family, she was just not a part of the family, but she was brought in to be raised, and she would be a servant of the family in the meantime. So it's a different meaning than it has, for example, in places like Cape Verde or in Jamaica, where it references the people who were born there, who are the result of this population exchange or population interchange. So there's that. The other issue that makes this so complicated is that the term Creole itself, even in linguistic discourse nowadays, is being called into question as a heuristic, as a term that has a scientific base, let's say, right? So yeah, it's a little wishy-washy. We use creoles, and some people have stopped using Creole, to reference languages that show the impact of language contact in a very concrete way, right? But in fact, as Professor Elias was mentioning just now, there are many other varieties which show the effect of intense linguistic contact, which normally are not called creoles. So, in fact, the essence of these languages is the same. And as you were pointing out, and you were pointing out as well, a place like Cochin is a place where linguistic contact has been happening for centuries, and you have all of these transformations and interchanges between different languages happening. So there's nothing special, let's say, about these particular varieties, right? So yeah, I would be a little careful. I use Creole because it's a well-known term in linguistic literature, and people know kind of what it means. But I myself am a little hesitant whether or not this is a term that's going to last long. On the other hand, if you don't have a specific way of referencing these languages, for example, you run the risk of conflating them with Portuguese or English or French or Dutch. And by doing that, you are annulling, you are ignoring the local transformations and the contribution of the local languages themselves. So using a term like Creole is also a way of autonomizing these languages vis-a-vis the colonial languages that were involved in their formation, right? So when you're referencing the outlook that people nowadays have on these languages, why they're interested in them, why there's a resurgence, even from within the communities that historically use them, you can have different positions. And one position is one that's integrative, right? That seeks out these communities from a Eurocentric perspective and tries to say, well, you are us. But you have a different approach, which is the one that I tend to, which stresses the uniqueness of those products, linguistic products, but also sociological products, like, and that recognizes, like we were saying, that recognizes the layers which are not European in their makeup, right? I'm not sure if I've made myself understood, but there are different perspectives that you can adopt when you look at these languages, communities, cultures, this process of fusion and transformation. Oh, let me just add, before I ask you a question, let me just add, you also mentioned social stratification, linguistic social stratification, and the different impact of different languages in a situation like this is clearly determined by social stratification. And that's why in Creole linguistics, you make a distinction between what you call the superstrate languages and the substrate languages. And the difference here is one of power, right? So, inequality is at the heart of these processes of linguistic transformation. And the languages which at that moment have the upper hand, the social and political and economic upper hand, or the superstrates, are the ones that are typically going to provide most of the lexicon. So when we talk about these communities, the fact that most of the lexicon is from Portuguese is a remnant, is a result of the social ascendant that Portuguese had within those particular communities during the colonial period. So inequality, and I want to stress this, inequality is present, and it has a linguistic impact. It shapes the way these languages transform themselves.
Now, I actually also mentioned about it from a visual art perspective, because we also have a certain kind of chronology of looking at Western art practices from India. So we all have almost all across the country, we have all British schools which taught us art. But actually, if you really look at them, and we were much more influenced by Dutch and, different kind of expressions from different regions. So I'm also looking at that, how these interesting sites of imaginations continue to influence us regardless
Yes.
So that was also one of my curiosities. So
Yes, but I think it is important. I mean, this is certainly a political stance, but I think it is important to look at these communities and their expressions, linguistic, cultural, musical, etc., as despite all of the violence and brutality of the history that they derive from, look at them as products of their spaces. So in the case of the Malabar Creoles, products of Kerala. So part of the of the intangible heritage of Kerala. Because, and there's a risk, of course, if you don't do that, of stigmatizing these communities, which I think is something that should be avoided.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. It was really comprehensive, and I'm not actually familiar with the word until now, so it was really enriching to know about that. So my area of interest is essentially with identity and how it is connected to language as such. So you've told that there is essentially a decline in the number of people who speak in the areas that you've said, Sri Lanka, India and all. But then you've also slightly spoken about how there is a re-emergence of this language in Singapore, if I'm not wrong, or was
Yes.
it? Yeah. So you talked about that in terms of identity. So I want to know how that is different from India as such. That's it.
I'm not sure it's different. The dynamics are not the same, but wherever you find these dynamics of resurgence or revitalization, such as you find in Singapore or such as you find in Macau, it is usually a response to the community's realization that the language is almost gone, right? And when the language is almost gone, at some point they realize, okay, we're missing out, we're losing something that's been with us, with our community, that's been a part of our community for many centuries. And then, of course, once there's this realization, communities may decide whether or not that's important, right? If it's important, they may make an effort to preserve at least some kind of memory or ceremonial representative use of the language. But a community may equally well decide this is not relevant, this is not important, right? And these are both possible positions. In Singapore and Macau, my impression is that the communities are trying to retain a little bit of the knowledge of these languages as a way of identifying themselves vis-a-vis their neighboring communities, right? So it's a way of preserving a certain distinctiveness within, the highly multicultural societies of Singapore and Macau, etc. We'll see what happens here. In fact, what I can tell you is that recently I've also been in touch with some members of the diaspora specifically from the region of Candanor in Australia. And I know that there's the same feeling of, we should do something to at least record a little bit of this tradition, otherwise we're going to lose it for good. So, we'll see what happens.
Just a follow-up question. Yeah.
I think there was one also at the back, but yeah.
Yeah, just wanted to know that about the speakers in India, are these essentially family members, or what is the range of the speakers, or where they're from, things like that?
Where they're from?
Yeah, or are they within the same family, or or essentially are they related? Yeah, about the speakers in general.
Yeah, the family is definitely the locus of transmission, right? So you might have, in all of these communities, you might have some families which preserve this transmission very strongly, and some families which don't preserve the transmission as strongly. But essentially they're community, let's say, community internal languages, because in all of these locations, these are minority languages, right? So these are things that you can use with your family, with your neighbors, but that's it, right? Because there are other languages which occupy the public space, right? There was one question at the back. I'm not sure if there's time for it.
What are the conversations or the questions that you ask the people who you're interviewing? Like, what the questions that you ask or the conversations that you have to get to get them to speak the output that you're looking for? So.
Many different ones. Really, you try to make it as varied as possible, because this is the way you can get access to more information, more lexicon, more topics. in a place like the Malabar, I was very interested in finding out how the grammar was used. So I would have little conversations. I would ask for stories, traditional stories like the ones you heard here. I would have conversations about everyday life. And then I would follow whatever topic the person was interested in talking about. So a lot of it was about community traditions, religious practice. But I also sat down with them and did what we call elicitation, which is when I ask for specific linguistic information. So I ask for translations from English, etc., so that I have an understanding of, or have access to the kind of minute linguistic data that I need for my description. So these are two different approaches. In the case of Sri Lanka, which was a much bigger project, with more people, more time, etc., as you can see, we tried to diversify as much as possible. So you had this lady cooking, and she gave us a lot of information about food and the activities of cooking. You had the interviews with a carpenter, but also with a blacksmith and with a priest and with a young person. So you try to diversify as much as possible so that you get information which is not just linguistic, but also, sociologically diverse.
Thank you, Hugo, for a wonderful presentation, and also especially to the audience for having an engaging, conversation. So it's been great that the space actually works excellent, because I think it carries a certain spirit of Kerala's history. So thank you, Aditi, for hosting us, and also on a working day, it's a great enthusiasm to kind of follow this kind of special lecture series. And thank you all for coming, and also a big thank you to Kerala Council for Historical Research, working along with us. Thank you, Hugo, again.
Thank you very much.
Have a great evening and a good weekend.